Beyond the hype and headlines, the 2016 elections matter more than you think. This event is co-sponsored by the Reed College of Media and is a featured panel of the David C. Hardesty Jr. Festival of Ideas. My name is Hillary Kinney, and I'm a junior journalism major here in the Reed College of Media. I am pleased to introduce our moderator for tonight's panel, Michael Tomasky. Michael is a special correspondent for the Daily Beast and the editor of Democracy, a journal of ideas, a leading quarterly journal of policy ideas based in Washington, D.C. He is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, where he writes on the Washington political scene. He is also a frequent commentator on MSNBC and other television and radio outlets. He is the author of 3 books, Left for Dead, Hillary's Turn, and the 2014 ebook, Yeah, 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 The Beatles and America, Then and Now.
That is definitely the best one of the 3.
A native of Morgantown, West Virginia, Tomasky earned his bachelor's degree in journalism from West Virginia University in 1982 and his master's degree from New York University in 1985. He is a longtime member of the College of Media's Visiting Committee, and this fall was awarded the college's Pearlie Isaac Reed Achievement Award, the most prestigious award given by the college to one of its alumni. Will you all please help me in welcoming Michael Tomasky?
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Hillary. Hillary, we're going to be talking about you tonight. No, that's that other Hillary, sorry. Gosh, good evening, everybody. Say good evening. Thank you. Thank you. Provost Joyce McConnell, Dean Reed, Dean Martinelli. Thank you all for hosting us, helping to put this together. I think it's going to be a great, fun night. We're going to talk about serious things, but we're going to have fun doing it. These are fun, smart people who have a lot of interesting things to say. And I want to thank them all for making the trip over here at my request to come join us tonight and talk to us. Before we get into all that, come in, have a seat. Just as a short point of personal, listen to that. Just as a short point of personal privilege, if I may, because I am the moderator, this room still gives me the willies a little bit. Because this room made me a journalist. I want to tell the story very briefly. I started my college career at WVU, and yes, laugh at this. This is a laugh line, as a pre-med major. Somehow I limped my way through my freshman year, but then in the sophomore year they start the weeding out classes. Organic chemistry and biology 101. Now in the popular vernacular, 101 means easy, but in those days it did not mean easy. I don't even understand today what that class was about. It met in this room, and it came time for the first test, and I really actually, this cannot be said, in all honesty, of every test Mike Tomasky took at West Virginia University, but for this one, I really, really studied hard. You know, I wanted to do, my mom wanted to have a doctor's son. I wanted to do well, and she handed out the tests, Professor Lohr, and it might as well have been written in Farsi. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. And came back to the next class, and she returned the tests, and I was sitting somewhere right up there by my friends Michael Bradley and Russ Kincaid, and somewhere up there, and I got my test back, and I opened the booklet, and I looked down at this huge red D. And that was the moment when I said, the heck with this, I'm becoming a journalist. So, well, not all of my readers are happy about that decision, but thanks nevertheless. All right, let's get to work, shall we? I'm going to talk just for a few more minutes about some of the things that I think are at stake in this election, and I want to say this especially to the students and the young people, because I think that this will end up being a particularly important election. And we say that about all elections, but let me try and make the case as to why I think that's so about this one. Of course, we will talk about Donald Trump, too, Trump's tweets and so on. But there are actually things at stake in this election. We haven't been talking about them so much so far, but we will. by next fall, I think, be talking about them. I think the bottom line is this. The results of this election will determine the political direction of the country, I think, for some time to come. And I think will determine whether we stay in what I call the Reagan era or whether we move on to some new, as yet unnamed era. Now, some of you may be saying, especially students, what, the Reagan, we're still in the Reagan era? That was a long time. Well, yes, it was a long time ago, but these political epochs tend to last a long time. The Roosevelt era, I think my panelists would agree, and I think most political scientists say so, lasted from 1932 to 1980. And yes, there were Republican presidents in there, but what I mean when I say era is the fundamental premises of the Roosevelt era, of the New Deal, that shaped that whole approach to governance, more or less, you know, with some variations, remained in force from 1932 until 1980, when Ronald Reagan came along. Then Ronald Reagan, of course, stood for many things that were diametrically opposed to the things that Roosevelt had stood for, not activist government, but small government, not comparatively high marginal tax rates, but tax rates as low as you could make them, and so on and so on. And we have fundamentally been in that era since then, with two Democratic presidents, but two Democratic presidents who, you know, liberal though they were in some respects, are in some respects, nevertheless, to a considerable extent, accept the premises that, you know, government should be limited. They're not going to try to do too much. They're going to stay within certain boundaries and certain parameters. Now, come to next year, next election. Well, I think it's pretty simple. If a Democrat wins, then a lot of what Barack Obama has done remains on the books. Then the Supreme Court is going to be a huge issue. People are going to be talking about it a lot by this time next year, because if a Democrat wins, presumably she or he will be able to appoint enough justices to flip the court back to being a liberal majority court, and that would have all kinds of ramifications throughout society. And on and on and on. We will be out if we have 12 or certainly 16 straight years of Democratic rule. We will be in something that I don't know yet what it is, but it won't be anymore the Reagan era. But if a Republican wins, then a lot of what Barack Obama did is going to be rolled back, right? They'll repeal Obamacare and other things. The Supreme Court will certainly not flip to a liberal majority. In fact, the conservative majority that now exists at 5-4 will probably become something like 6-3 or even 7-2. And we will be still fundamentally in the perhaps tail end, or perhaps not, of the Reagan era. So students, I encourage you to think about the issues in these historical terms, because these periods, they last a long time. They shape the basic parameters, the permissible definition of the political conversation that takes place in Washington and in the country. And what happens in this election may determine the shape of that conversation until you're 40 or 50 years old. So having said that, it's now everyone else's turn to talk. I'm done, and I'm going to start near me. You can read everyone's biographies in your paper that was handed to you, so I won't bother to do that. I'll merely sing their praises and say that Jamel Bowie, who is the chief political correspondent of Slate, is really one of the sharpest political writers in Washington. So we're lucky to have him. With that, Jamel, take it away. Tell us what you think about all this.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the university for inviting us all out here to talk and to discuss and have a little fun. I wanted to sort of start, so Michael mentioned the Supreme Court, and I think that's sort of an obvious place to talk about why 2016 is so important, how it could be such a monumental election. But I wanted to move the conversation to areas of federal policymaking and state policymaking that aren't so obvious, but I think are just as monumental, thinking about the kind of country we're going to have going forward. So for me, at least, one way to look at the post-1968 America is a story both of the growing and gradual integration of racial minorities into the American mainstream in very important ways, and also a gradual retrenchment in the federal government's commitment to putting its hand against a legacy of discrimination, right? And so over the past 10 years, for instance, we've seen rollbacks in voting rights. The Supreme Court gutted the section of the Voting Rights Act that kind of basically prevented southern states from changing their election laws unilaterally. The Supreme Court has rolled back affirmative action. The Supreme Court has rolled back sort of other areas of civil rights law, and states as well have taken the lead on this as well. In North Carolina, in Georgia, in Alabama, but basically throughout the entire South, we have new voting rights laws, or not voting rights laws, but voter ID laws that very much restrict access to the ballot. Thanks to the Supreme Court ruling in 2012 on the Affordable Care Act, the Medicaid expansion, basically, if you looked at where it covers and where it doesn't cover, a good chunk of where it doesn't cover is the former Confederacy. And so you have all these areas, which I would just call civil rights retrenchment, places where the federal government is sort of walking back. And there are also places where the federal government is not retrenching, where the federal government is still putting its hand forward. So you have housing segregation, housing access. The Department of Housing and Urban Development has recently announced new rules designed to kind of encourage the creation of affordable housing and to integrate more communities. You have the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, which is sort of reacting to the Supreme Court's moves around voting rights and doing its best to kind of push back against states that are passing very restrictive voting laws. You have that same department working with states and localities to find ways to reform police departments and to encourage different modes of policing in response to incidents that we all know about, so I'm not going to bother recounting here. You have, again, the Justice Department is doing a lot of the heavy lifting here, so I'm going to continue listening to things the Justice Department is doing. Suing mortgage companies for issuing loans, discriminatory loans to Black and Latino communities. So this is what the federal government's doing, kind of both in response to what the court has moved back on, what states have moved forward with, and kind of we're in this sort of civil rights stasis where there's forward movement, there's backwards movement. I think the 2016 election will be a moment where we kind of will see if that forward movement will continue from the federal government, and if Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders is replacing Supreme Court justices. I mean, there is a more liberal court 5 years down the road that will really shape what civil rights law and what the government can do on all levels to address issues of discrimination. And unfortunately, if Republicans elected next year, it's actually a little unclear what happens. The Republican Party, in at least its recent incarnation, hasn't had the same commitment to using government to deal with the legacy of discrimination. And there's a very good chance that a Republican president would bring some things from the states to the federal government. So a federal voter ID law, which quite a few civil rights activists believe would demonstrably reduce the amount of people who participate in our elections, not just African American, but Latino, but low-income whites, people who don't have ready access to federal identification or state identification. A Republican president may simply decide not to continue on with the Justice Department's various moves in trying to address issues of police conduct, try to address issues of financial misconduct from banks and mortgage companies. 2 minutes. All right. That was really quick too. I have my timer here and it's fast. So with all of that said, I think this is really monumental. I think we have made a lot of progress as a country towards fully integrating racial minorities, communities that have borne the brunt of historic discrimination, and I think there's still a lot of work to do, and I think it's necessary work. I think we should all want a country where African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, everyone has a fair shot at going as far as their abilities will take them. And there's still meaningful and significant structural barriers for that. And we face a choice next year, really between a political coalition, the Democratic Party, that because it represents many of these groups is very invested in doing what it can to reduce those barriers, and a political party that because it doesn't quite represent those groups, or at least they don't make up a large share of its voters, is either reticent and in some cases opposed to some of those efforts. And some of that opposition is total good faith belief in the role of government and what government should do. But this is where I see things going forward and why I think 2016 will be unusually momentous, because these sorts of things are very path dependent. Once we go on one track here, that's where we'll be until there is some kind of large shock in terms of how Americans conceive of these issues. That was the case after Emancipation. That was the case after Reconstruction. That was the case after the Civil Rights Act. And I think it's going to be the case in this kind of odd period that we're in the moment.
Great, thank you. Now, Paige Lavender. Paige, my fellow mountaineer, a fellow alumnus of the College of Media, the senior politics editor at Huffington Post. Let's take it in a little bit of a different direction. So you don't write about this stuff, but you edit lots of stories, and you do all those hidden, secret, magical things that editors do to make writers look smart. So from that point of view, what's your perspective? You have a sense of what readers care about, what stories they read, what stories they don't read, what issues they're interested in. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Like Mike said, I'm a politics editor at the Huffington Post, but more importantly, I'm a mountaineer, and I'm very, very happy and honored to be here. So thanks for having me, and thanks for coming out. Just to give you guys some background on what I do, because like he said, I'm not doing a lot of deep dive reporting like these guys are. I do handle a lot of breaking news and a lot of surface level stuff, and but I do a lot of planning, and a lot of what my job is just knowing what readers want to hear about, and readers are voters. So what I care about is, everything that is going on in Washington right now is so very important. But I tend to think that a lot of political journalists, at times can think very inside the Beltway and not so much think about what voters around America want. And so as an editor in my job, what I do is I try to kind of gauge what our readers are interested in, like what issues matter to you guys. So I'm really happy that we're doing a Q&A today because I want to hear from all of you guys. I'm really excited. So to get a little personal, when I was a student here, Obama was elected, clearly an important historic election. And I wasn't that into politics then. It's like my big dirty secret. So I'm hoping, if you guys don't take anything else from this panel, I hope that you understand how important it is to read, about politics and to become involved and to figure out what issues are important to you and what will be important to you 20 or 30 years down the road. Because like Mike was saying, this election is really going to kind of shape how the future of politics is and how the future of our country is with the Supreme Court and the presidency and the Reagan era. And so I think it's important for you guys now to figure out what you care about and what you want to be asking of your leaders in the country. And so, like I said, as a politics editor at HuffPost, I gauge a lot of that. So I saw a couple Bernie shirts in the audience already, which didn't surprise me at all based on what I know from our readers. A lot of what I focus on at HuffPost is gun control legislation, criminal justice reform, marijuana legalization, very much social issues. So I'm happy to talk about all of those things and just to learn more from you guys while we're here today.
Okay, thanks. Now, I've done many dumb things in my career, but one of the smartest ones I ever did was hire this young man named Ezra Klein. 9 years ago? 10?
10 years ago.
10 years ago. Goodness. Ezra Klein is Ezra Klein, and the microphone is his.
Okay, I want to convince you of 3 things here. One is you shouldn't listen to me. The second is you shouldn't listen to Mike. And the third is you shouldn't listen to yourselves, and I'll do that in order. No one on this panel, nobody you're hearing from in the media right now knows a goddamn thing about what's going on in this election. It is our job to sound confident, and it is just straight bullshit up and down right now. I don't know a single person anywhere in the media who predicted 5 months ago that we would have Donald Trump and Ben Carson exhibiting a persistent, significant lead. And not just that, by the way, but Trump, Carson, Fiorina, and Cruz combining for more than 60% of the Republican nomination. who predicted that Sanders would have been as strong a challenge to Clinton as he's been, who would have predicted that Boehner would have stepped down in the middle of a congressional session and literally walked into the press conference where he did it, whistling zippity-doo-dah. That is a real thing that happened in the most advanced democracy the world has ever known. You should consider the implications of that. My view right now is that all of us who talk and opine about politics need to be doing it with a fair dose of humility. We have, whether we admit it or not, we have models, implicit, explicit, that help us generate predictions, that help us understand what's going on in American politics at any given moment. These models, they run in sort of the background of our cognitive processes, and they are how we take new information and spit it out into something we can say on TV before they cut to a commercial break, so you all don't change the channel. And they are failing a lot. It doesn't mean in the end they will fail. Something very interesting, Jamel and I were talking about this earlier tonight. If you talk to anyone, as far as I can tell, if you talk to anyone in the media right now, and I was just at a gathering of a bunch of Republican pundits and a bunch of Democratic ones, everybody seems to agree that on the Republican side, it's going to come down to Cruz and Rubio. Not literally everyone, but that was like 95% of the people in that room. The very conservative people, the very liberal people. There is just no evidence anywhere that that is happening. It is so hard for us to give up the models of how we understand American politics, that despite all evidence yet to the contrary, despite the fact that Rubio has not moved more than 4 points in the polls, we refuse to believe that the number 1 and number 2 candidates who've been leading now for months are actually leading. And I also refuse to believe that. I want to be clear, this is my fault too. But I really think that we are in a space right now where you need to understand what's being said as the continuous generation of hypotheses. I don't think we are sure. I don't think we know what is going on with a high degree of certainty. And I think that there is a lot of covering our asses happening right now in the media, and you should be careful with it. I think it is possible that we are seeing long-running changes beginning to tip, and that doesn't mean they're all going to tip this year, but I do think the way the traditional political science model of how primary works is that ultimately the party apparatus, and political scientists will define the party apparatus pretty broadly, ends up deciding who gets the nomination primarily by controlling the information flow, primarily by people who you trust. If you're a Republican, someone, Republican endorsers, Fox News personalities. If you're a Democrat, liberal media personalities like on MSNBC, or Democratic candidates, or Bill Clinton, or whatever. What the party is fundamentally doing, and the party very loosely defined, is giving you informational cues. We have been in an extended period where information has become less controlled by elites, where it is much easier to see what is going on at any given moment and much harder to hide what is happening. And I think that as that resource becomes more widely spread, the mix of skills that are going to be rewarded in presidential primaries might change. So for instance, Jeb Bush is very good at an inside game in American politics. It is clear that is not going to be enough for him this year. All right. Number 2, the reason I'm careful about you trusting Mike, and I say that having been edited by him for a number of years, is that I think it always may be the most important election, and it always may be not that important, and is wise not to get too caught up in that kind of thing. So the 2000 election was supposed to be a very unimportant election, Tweedledee and Tweedledum. It was 2 guys, a moderate Republican, a moderate Democrat. We were in peace and prosperity, surpluses as far as the eye could see. People were so chill about that election. A bunch of them voted for Ralph Nader for some reason. And then Osama bin Laden decided to attack on 9/11. Fast forward 4 years, I remember, and I wasn't at the American Prospect yet for this, but the 2004 election, Kerry versus Bush, was frequently called the most important election of our lifetime. People were constantly talking about what an epochal moment it was. Kerry lost. I think in the grand analysis of history, that was clearly a very good thing for American liberalism. If he had won, he would have ended up taking a lot of responsibility for the fiasco in Iraq, for the financial crisis. Democrats would have never developed their huge majorities over '06 and '08. You never would have had Obama, Obamacare, a tremendous sweep of liberal policymaking that you've seen between 2009 and 2010 that will shape American politics going forward. I disagree with Mike that if Republicans win the presidency, they'll be able to repeal Obamacare. I think it's always very hard looking at these things to say what is going to be important. So really, I urge you to treat every election as the most important election. Events are very, very hard to predict. But the final thing I'll say here is that when we talk about most important elections, we always talk about the presidency. Nobody ever says this midterm election is the most important election of your lifetime. Congress is much more powerful than the president. Congress is much more powerful than the president. And one thing happening right now is Democrats feel real good about themselves because they've won 5 of the last 6 popular votes in the presidency. They currently control nothing in American politics but the White House, not the Supreme Court, not the Senate, not the House, not state legislatures, not governors' mansions. They are locking themselves out of power by not being able to be a participant in redistricting. We have a systematic overrepresentation of concern about American presidential elections, and we vastly understate the importance of congressional, gubernatorial, state, and local. And that's something you all do, by the way. Like Paige, I'm pretty familiar with traffic patterns on the internet, and I can tell you, you all like hearing about presidential elections, and you don't much care about the stuff going on beneath that. But Congress comes first in the Constitution for a reason. It is tremendously powerful. And every time, and a consistent problem right now in American politics is that there are a lot of people who turn out for presidential elections and then ignore midterm elections, ignore off-cycle elections. The impact of those is very, very big. And if you need to see why, look at the difference between '09 and '10 when Obama passed a tremendous amount of important legislation and what happened after that, where he basically hasn't passed major legislation since. We're done. Now they don't trust anybody. It's all good, Mike.
I should have cut you off before you got to that part about not trusting me. Mercedes Schlapp, I met in the green room at the Fox News Channel. And we've been on TV several times together. And her husband, Matt Schlapp, is the head of the American Conservative Union. You might recognize him from television appearances and so on. But they drove over today and have to drive back tonight to help with this science project. So
if there's any science majors that want to come with me home, you can come home with us. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the College of Media for inviting us to be here. I did drag my husband to join me. He was the driver, although I think I drove most of the way over here. And I think I'm the sole conservative on this panel. And since he's chairman of the American Conservative Union, I'm just going to tell you, CPAC is March 1st through the 5th at National Harbor in Maryland. You have to come. It is a wonderful event if you want to go hang out with some conservative, like-minded, and libertarians out there. So I don't know if they'll let the Bernie people in. No, you're always welcomed. Always welcome. So why this election? You know, I agree with Ezra. I think every election is critical. It's important. You know, I think you got to ask yourself 3 questions. One is, are we living in a safer world today than before? I mean, we see what's happening in the Middle East and Syria with the expansion of ISIL. You know, you have to ask yourself the question, what role do you want government to play in your lives? Do you want more government, less government? You know, there's a fundamental battle going on right now that we haven't seen in a long time. We actually have from the socialist Democrat of Bernie Sanders running, saying we need more government spending, we need more government involvement, we need greater redistribution of wealth. And then you have Donald Trump, the billionaire, and several of the other Republican candidates talking about free market and trade and less government involved in your lives. And so I think when it comes down to this election and your choice for 2016, it really is about where do you want government to be in your lives? What we've seen under President Obama has been excessive regulations that have impacted businesses. We've seen an overreach on immigration. Ezra talked about the power of Congress, but he's actually had a lot of executive authority come out, basically, in essence, using his powers excessively. And so you got to ask yourselves, for the next president, are we going to move towards, I mean, who thought in our country, in the United States of America, we'd be talking about socialism or capitalism? It's quite a phenomenon. It's almost like, are we getting to a point that we want to be the United States of America, or do we want to move towards a more European style of government? And that's, I think, a fundamental question, especially for the millennials, in where they fall in this category, and where they want to vote, on issues that I know that in looking at research that millennials care about, like climate change, or where they are on marijuana legalization, or on the social issues. And I think that it's important for millennials to really think, the more we have government in our lives, is it something that's beneficial, or is it hurtful in our country? And I think the third point is when you look at your lives individually, so we've kind of done the world, are we safer in the world? The nation, where do we want our government to be? And the self, right? So where do you want to be in 10, 15, 20 years? Where do you see your life? And when I say that, it's because elections do matter, because they impact your life personally. It's going to determine the economic growth in our country. It will determine how your healthcare, education will be managed. And so you got to be thinking about, when you look at millennials in particular, where they've struggled and have probably a harder chance of maybe getting a job when they get out of college, or they're competing with other individuals because there's lower wages and they can't even compete for the jobs. I mean, just a study came out today that 36% of young women are living with their parents and their relatives. And so you got to ask yourself the question, when you look at your life and you look at yourself in the future and you ask yourself, what policies do I want that are going to impact and basically provide better policies in the United States, not only from an economic perspective, but also from a social perspective, and I think, and from a foreign policy perspective, because we live in a global society. So I think those are important questions to ask as you think through this election. Matt and I we have 5 daughters, and I have to tell you, it's when you look at your kids and you see where we're headed in our country, you worry. And I think that there is this sort of, you want to be optimistic and you want to choose a leader that's going to be visionary and bring hope to our society. I think that there was that sense when President Obama first got elected. And then when you look at the numbers, the millennials kind of shifted, and I wondered if they were disenchanted with Obama, although they supported him in the beginning. And so it is going to be a question of, are we going to stay more looking as more as United States of America, where we support free market, less regulation, less government in our lives, or do we really want to move to a point where we are going to be more government dependent? And that's, I think, a very critical question that we're really asking ourselves right now for this next election.
Mercedes, the odds are that perhaps 2 of your daughters are going to grow up to be Democrats.
Yeah, and with that, they will not be getting any of our inheritance, I'd like to add.
I ran into Grover Norquist once wheeling around his then about 4-year-old daughter, and I said, "You're teaching her to think for herself, right?" And he said, "Don't get carried away."
That's right.
Now, we have to wrap up at 8:45, so we're going to move through some questions quickly. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and please don't give long answers, but we do want to hear what all of you have to say about these things, and then we'll get to you folks for some questions. And then we'll have a little straw poll at the end, but we're saving that for last. Now, so Donald Trump, he is the story of this thing so far, and lately Ben Carson some too. So we had all these predictions, Ezra alluded to this, we had all these predictions that this event was going to bring Trump down, that this event was going to bring Trump down, and none of these events have brought Trump down. And yes, no one really thinks he's going to be the Republican nominee, but he obviously has strength. Why haven't any of these things brought him down?
I think it's a couple of things. The first is that I think support for Donald Trump is not necessarily for Trump as Trump. I think a lot of people really do love his persona. He's very entertaining. I saw him in Dallas, Texas a couple months ago. It was fun. It was a fun event to go to. People were very excited. But I think what's driving the Trump phenomena, first and foremost, is a real profound sense of insecurity among a lot of Americans. Top-line economic numbers show a positive story, but in a lot of communities across the country, and in places where I'm from, Southeast Virginia, there are plenty of places in Southeast Virginia that are very, very depressed and very poor. And people do not feel that the political elites who are supposed to be looking out for them, who are supposed to be doing things that help improve their lives, are doing them. And Trump, at the very least, is saying this openly and saying, I can not only can I identify the people who are harming your livelihood, but I will stand up for you. One of the most interesting things about Trump to me is how similar he is to George Wallace in the 1968 and 1972 elections, who made a very similar pitch to many Americans. George Wallace, governor of Alabama, famous for being a staunch defender of segregation as governor of Alabama and in the 64 election as well. But by 68, his message has changed a little bit. His message is essentially, political elites don't care about you. Political elites are willing to let the cost of social change, of economic change, fall on you, the ordinary person. And I won't do that. If you elect me president, I will protect your interests from this monumental change. That's, I think, what Trump is saying, and I think people are responding to it. And I think it's completely understandable that people are responding to it. I'm not sure what, if any, force will take Trump down. Maybe he'll get tired of running. Maybe he won't. But I do think that whatever happens to Trump, other people in the Republican race will understand this dynamic and try to capitalize on it in whichever way they can. And I do think part of the story of this election is a choice between, are we going to embrace a vision of these problems that is very exclusionary, that says these are the people who are keeping you down, or are we going to take a vision of these problems that is, here's how we can join together and work together to fix them?
Paige, how much staying power do you think Donald Trump has?
I think he has, he commands his own staying power. I think the reason he's still leading in the polls and still sort of out there as this major figure in the race is because he makes it so. He insists that it is that way. I love to talk about Trump as an entertainer because that's what he is an entertainer, and he has been, and a businessman. And also, he's cocky as hell. So I think that, when you look at how he's approached things in his business life and his entertainment life, I mean, even if you look at The Apprentice, when he's tired of someone, it's you're fired and then you're done, you're out of there. And then when you look at the Miss Universe or Miss USA, whatever organization it is, and in his NBC contract earlier this year, he kind of sensed that there was trouble there, and then he ended it, and he said, I'm the one who ended this relationship. I'm the one who made this decision. And my sort of prediction is that it's going to get that way in the race. And I'm only basing that on the way that he's been in his former endeavors. But I think that, now he's starting to kind of slip behind Ben Carson in some polls. And he's saying, I'm still number one. Like, he's still saying that. He's still asserting that he is the leader in the race and he is the best person. And I think that once he starts to lose a little popularity, which I think he will, because if you've watched the debate so far, there have been 4 Republican debates now. Yeah. This last one that was just on Tuesday was far less about Trump and more about the other candidates. And he commanded a lot less attention. And I think the more that happens, the more he's going to realize it's not going to be him, and he's going to end the relationship, and he's going to end the campaign. That's my prediction. But I think that so many people really get behind him because, I mean, it's, you look at Washington, and who's getting anything done? No one is. And Trump, he has all these claims. I'm a businessman. I'm doing this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to get Mexico to build a wall. I'm going to do all of these things. And so I think that, in a way, the word I'm going to use is refreshing, although I think some people wouldn't agree that it's refreshing. But it's refreshing to some people to see this businessman just be so commanding and assertive, like, I'm going to do this, when you look at Washington and nobody's really getting anything done. And so I feel like that's the reason he has been so successful for so long and commanding so much attention.
Ezra, do you see him still out there next April, Pennsylvania primary, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Somebody who never saw any of this coming, let me tell you where it's going to go. Confidently, with aggression in my voice. Something I do think is interesting about Trump is that he's not a new or unusual phenomenon. Mercedes talked about the fear that America will become Europe. I think sometimes there's a cramped view of what separates America from Europe, that certainly on the right is sort of a couple percentage points of public sector GDP. But Europe has a very different set of political institutions than we do. And it fosters very, very different kinds of political parties. And something we've seen arise in many European countries in recent years is this merging of nativist sentiment and a kind of soft economic populism. Keep the immigrants out, but don't cut Social Security. We have always seen in polling that this is a powerful presence in American politics, and in the past, Perot and Buchanan certainly have both tapped into it. What Trump is tapping into is not something all that new. It's something that the two political parties generally suppress. Democrats are the party of that kind of economic populism, of expanding Social Security and Medicare, but they're also typically the party of openness to immigration, of a more diverse political coalition. Republicans are the party of sort of America as it is, or a party that has a sharper hold on the traditionalist strains in American thought, but they also tend to be the party that wants to cut taxes and shrink the size of government, which a lot of more economically struggling white voters actually don't want. So I think one thing that is worth keeping an eye on with Trump is the degree to which he is demonstrating, as others have demonstrated before and as we repeatedly see in other countries, that there are political coalitions that are not represented in America, but that exist in America. There is something substantive that he is taking advantage of. And so I wouldn't expect it, even if his phenomenon peters out, to be just him. He's showing there is more here than what goes on, and I think that it's very easy to dismiss Trump as all show, very easy to dismiss him as just a personality. But one I think, fascinating hypothetical here is, what if Trump was actually a more legitimate candidate who held these same positions? It's possible that in some ways the appeals of Trumpism are being blunted by the personal idiosyncrasies of Donald Trump, but that the successor to Trumpism is going to be a more credible candidate, but who is also shaking up the boundaries of political ideology in that same way.
Mercy, you're the conventional wisdom is that Trump has the Republican establishment freaked out for all the obvious reasons. And since you're the closest thing we have here to that, is that true, or is he good for the Republican Party? I mean, let's face it, he's right that 5 times as many people are watching these debates because of him.
I think I've been on Xanax for about 6 months. I have to tell you, my party's a mess right now, but I think it's part of like the healthy family fight at the same time, I have to say. I think what's so fascinating about Donald Trump is that he besides not being a traditional candidate, he doesn't do anything traditionally. From a media standpoint, the man, normally in a traditional campaign, and I've worked on 2 presidential campaigns, you have spokespeople. Okay, the media calls in, you say, okay, you need to speak to the spokesperson, or you can't give that interview, the candidate's not available. Trump will answer the reporter's call. Trump will call into morning shows, 2 and 3 morning shows in a day. He drives the news. He has a media dominance. He's been able to become his own opposition research, his own pollster, and he's the one that has been able to basically pull out the weaknesses of all of his candidates. And that is a fascinating new model of politics. And to know that these other candidates in the GOP side have not been able to capture that is so interesting to me. So while I think for Trump, his numbers may not grow, because you got to always be looking at candidates where, okay, who has a possibility of growth here? And you have to see who's going to drop out of the race and how that's going to impact the numbers. The mere fact is that he comes across with that winning, I'm a winner. I can self-finance my campaign. I don't need anybody's money. So he can stay in this for the long haul if he wants to. It's going to be on his terms. But again, he runs into a wall, maybe not the Trump wall in Mexico, but he's going to run into a wall where can he grow that coalition? I mean, you can have that angry group of Republicans that are emotional, that are really not in favor of illegal immigration, that agree with Donald Trump on immigration, for example. But can he bring in the establishment type of Republicans who are on the sidelines going, wait a second here, he could actually become our nominee? And this is from high-level Republican officials who are saying, yes, this could actually happen. And not only that, but there's also been media analysts who have come out. Chris Wallace was one of them for Fox News, who says he really could become the Republican nominee. So there is that possibility that exists. And yes, is the Republican Party nervous? Well, when you have Reince Priebus coming out and having him the RNC chair and having him say, please sign this pledge and don't go as an independent, They are nervous, but it's a reality that that's existing right now. And unfortunately, we have to really kind of play by Donald Trump's rules to see how this is going to shake out.
I have two more questions that I want to ask, and I want to wrap through them in like 10 minutes, and then turn it over to the audience. The first, since we are here under the auspices, or I guess co-auspices of the Reed College of Media, let's ask a question about the media's role in this election. We've seen many changes in the last two presidential election cycles, with the rise of YouTube and the rise of social media and so forth. Is there anything about this election, about the media's role in this election that's different, that's new, that these folks should be mindful of and say, oh, I got to keep an eye on that?
I'm happy to take this one. I'll step up. I think what's really interesting, and this isn't really limited just to the election either, you see this a lot from the White House, is that the campaigns and the people themselves are really taking control of their message. I say the White House because they are releasing a lot of things on Medium now and doing things on Instagram and Tumblr and wherever they are. Like all of these social media platforms, they're really utilizing those. And you see the campaigns really doing the same thing. Maybe like a good example of this is, Ben Carson is has this sort of posturing now that he thinks the media is attacking him personally more than any other candidate ever, even more so than when everybody was scrutinizing Barack Obama's birth certificate, which I found really curious. But so he's saying, he's being personally attacked, and before this debate on Tuesday, his campaign took to their Facebook page and was posting all of these sort of like fake headlines, kind of mocking the media. One of them was actually targeting the Huffington Post, so it caught my eye. It was like Ben Carson accidentally threw a glass bottle away in a trash can instead of a recycle bin in college or something like that. Kind of like making fun of how his campaign is saying the media is really nitpicking at him as a candidate by questioning statements he's made in the past and positions he's taken on things. So I think that it's just fascinating the way that these lawmakers and politicians are able to take control of their own message and not be so reliant on the media to shape things. I mean, it used to be, it was so important to, give a journalist a scoop and break the story in the right way, and that's still important. It's still a very big factor. I'm not trying to discourage all of the journalists in the room here. But now, when a campaign has an important message, they can take it directly to social media. And then also that works in conjunction too, like to go back to HuffPost, because that's what I know. We actually had a really viral video last week of Chris Christie. He was on the campaign trail at an event. There weren't a ton of cameras there, but we had a camera crew there, and he went into this like deeply personal story about drug addiction and drug abuse and opiates and all of that. And so we filmed it. His campaign knew we filmed it. We put it on Facebook on a Friday night, and it has like millions of views, like 6 million views or something. It just caught on for some reason, a 6-minute long video with no subtitles, and Chris Christie just droning on for 6 minutes, and everybody was eating it up. And then his campaign, liked it on Facebook, and they tweeted it out, and they shared it with everyone. So, in a way, they're controlling their own message, but they're also sort of able to use the media coverage of their message in a way that benefits them or however, which I found that really fascinating.
So I have a comment. I tend to think that in terms of politics, there really isn't that much new under the sun. And I look to 19th century or late 19th century politics, and I see an era of mass communication, of mass politics, of politics as, in some sense, entertainment, a time when candidates, there was not really a news media to mediate relationships between candidates and voters. It very much was candidates speaking directly to voters. It was, I think, recognizably modern. And so what I see in the current period is really a very familiar kind of media relationship, even going down to how fractured media is. The idea of an objective media, it's very recent in American history. It basically spans the middle of the 20th century. Before that, media was fractured and it was partisan. And that seems to be what we're returning to in large regards. And I think the dynamics that comes with that, sort of a hyper-mass politics, where politics is as much entertainment as it is information, is coming back with it. And I don't see this as a bad thing. I don't see it as a good thing. It's just a thing.
That's right. Well, I think when it comes to the media, this is the first time I've really seen this battle between the GOP and the media. And I think to Paige's point, Ben Carson really symbolizes this fight that's going on. And the fact is that this distrust of the media. It's a fact that for Ben Carson, he was able to raise $3 million in 1 week because of the fact that he felt that he was being a victim to the press, that he was being victimized, that he was basically being targeted, that they were digging into these stories that were 50 years ago. And so he used it for his advantage. And why? Because when you look at the American public and the poll numbers, it's like 20% that basically trust the media. So it's a fascinating play, which I think for on the Republican side, that's actually helped the Republican candidates to say, hey, enemy number one over here is the press, and they're going after us. And so I think that's been an interesting dynamic that we've seen so far in the race.
Got anything for us?
I can if you'd like.
Yeah, I'd like, yeah.
All right.
90 seconds.
Media. Enough with the media. I think I agree a little bit with Jamel here. I'm not sure anything is that new. I mean, even I agree with the trend Mercedes is pointing out, but I remember Newt Gingrich doing the same thing Ted Cruz was doing and winning a bunch of debates by attacking the moderators. I feel like even that mistrust of the media, those low poll numbers, they're enduring. The one thing I do think is interesting, and this was present in 2012, but not to the same extent, is that the media is taking much more of its cues of who to cover and how much through a kind of feedback mechanism from, I don't want to say the voters, but from activated, intense groups that share things on social media. So one reason there was so much Bernie Sanders coverage early on was not because he was even doing that well in the polls, it's because everyone in the media noticed simultaneously that if you wrote about Bernie Sanders, it went to the top of the Reddit. It went to the top of Reddit like that. Donald Trump is very similar. He started getting more and more coverage because he was a good story. This is not new. It is not the first time the media has covered candidates because those candidates seem to get better ratings or make for a more interesting story. But the speed of that feedback loop, the quantity of the information we have about that, the granularity with which we know how to press those buttons and what the audience will respond to, that does shape coverage in powerful ways. And the coverage in turn has a sort of self-fulfilling cycle. It raises candidates up. So I do think that's an interesting trend here. But again, it's a continuation, an acceleration of something going on for a long time, not something fully new.
Quick lightning round. I love the sort that the candidates objected to.
I will not run as a third-party candidate. I'm willing to say that now.
All right, we're done then. That's what I was going to ask. No, I'm going to name a few candidates, and each of you give me like a sentence or two on the state of his or her campaign. Just an assessment of where they are so far. Hillary Clinton, sentence or two.
Probably going to win the Democratic nomination.
They all know that.
Yeah, but I mean, there's literally nothing else to say.
Well, no, they don't all know that. I'm sorry.
I mean, there really isn't much to say. I mean, just the dynamics of how the Democratic primary operates are such that in order to overturn a front runner or an establishment candidate in the Democratic Party, you have to win the largest group or a good share of the largest group of Democratic stalwart voters, and those are African Americans in the South. And so unless Bernie Sanders can, between now and South Carolina, peel off half of black voters, and Hillary Clinton's going to win.
Paige, how's her campaign been?
Well, it's fun to watch her try to loosen up. She's very stiff. Actually, The Onion had a really good piece it was like an op-ed from Hillary called I Am Humorous or something like that. It was really great. So yeah, that's what she's working on now, and it's interesting to watch. It's kind of painful at times.
Ezra?
Both underrated and overrated.
That's a good one.
Got it.
She's probably dancing La Macarena because so excited that the GOP is such a mess right now.
Bernie Sanders?
I'm really mechanistic in my view of these things. Bernie Sanders is, it's both a bit remarkable to see how quickly and how fast and how strong his challenge has been, but it's also not really that unfamiliar, right? Like Bernie Sanders looks a lot like Howard Dean. He looks a lot like Bill Bradley. You can easily imagine a world where Barack Obama does not win Iowa, and Barack Obama's campaign looks a lot like what Bernie Sanders is running now. So I'm impressed by his campaign. I'm impressed by the extent to which he's energized voters. He just picked up an important endorsement in Ohio today. But fundamentally, Bernie Sanders looks like something we've seen before, and I have no reason to think that he's going to be on any different of a trajectory than other similar candidates. It's almost sort of nice how stable the Democratic primary is compared to the Republican one. It makes me feel confident about life.
I count on other things for that. Paige?
I just think he's fun to cover. I mean, I know it's nothing new to see people rally around somebody like that, but it's fun to see voters be energized over anything, and his base truly is energized. So,
It's not just that Bernie Sanders is not going to win the Democratic presidential nomination, but he's not really running to win it.
Yeah.
His big moment of the debates, the one that people clapped the hardest for, when he stood back and said, the American people have heard enough about the damn emails, that was a moment that signaled that he's not really going to try to destroy the front runner, that he is running in a way to be heard. And I'm not saying he doesn't want to win, but even something that makes him different, Howard Dean would have ripped your throat out.
Yeah.
And to be very clear, Barack Obama would have ripped your throat out.
Yeah.
I mean, they were running to win, and they were willing to destroy the people in their way. Bernie Sanders fundamentally isn't. He's a very principled guy all through his candidacy, all through his career in public service. He's not giving up those principles to become a different kind of candidate. And in that way, I don't think Bernie Sanders is not willing to win if he can't win on his terms, and Bernie Sanders cannot win on his terms, so he is not going to win.
Mercedes?
I think what Bernie Sanders has taught us is the importance of basically an organic social media campaign. He's been, I think, very effective in really bringing in the small donors to support him, and sort of a bit of a movement. With that being said, I think to Ezra's point, he literally must be just beating himself up for handing over the nomination to Hillary Clinton after making that comment. And I do say that Larry David in SNL gives an incredible, I'm wondering if he's like cloned, like if he goes out on the campaign trail when Bernie's so tired.
And lastly, George Pataki. No. Marco Rubio. Let's try him.
Marco Rubio is interesting. I think that the sense I get from watching the Republican race and more from listening to Republican voters is that, Marco Rubio is compared to Obama quite a bit, but I don't think the dynamic is quite the same. I think with Rubio, a lot of Republicans see someone who really does represent the future of their party. I think with Obama, Democrats kind of figure that if it wasn't going to be Obama, it was going to be Clinton, and either one would have won, either one would have been a big change. But I think a lot of Republicans look at their party, they look at Rubio, and they say, this is really the guy that can move us into the future, and I think that's an unusual dynamic, and I'm interested to see where it goes.
I think it's interesting to look at his relationship with millennial voters. He has this line that he repeats every chance that he gets about how he had student loans, and he's very relatable financially to young people, and so I think he's going to keep playing that up for the rest of the campaign. However, I think he's very green in a lot of ways, and I definitely don't think he could win in a matchup against Hillary Clinton.
Wow.
Marco Rubio is a candidate who every Democrat cannot believe the Republicans will not nominate.
Marco Rubio is Hillary Clinton's greatest threat.
Yeah, same thing. Like, I think Democrats are watching this and like, you're not going to nominate that guy? You're going to, one of these other people? Are you serious?
Effective communicator, can speak Spanish and English, and really has a draw. I think he really is able to present an inspirational message. With that being said, I think there is that concern that he doesn't have a lot of accomplishments to his name, and that could be a challenge. But I do believe that the Clinton campaign will be very nervous if he becomes a nominee.
He did help pass an excellent immigration bill in the Senate.
That never happened.
We're trying to forget that, Ezra.
I don't think accomplishments matter.
Now,
Really, if you
It doesn't when you look at President Obama. It's the same,
no.
same scenario.
When you look at,
you set her
It's
up
the
for that
truth. He
one.
was a junior senator.
I challenge the audience to look at America's presidents and try to draw any sort of one-to-one connection between what they accomplished before they were president and what they accomplished as president.
Or whether they were nominated.
Or whether they were nominated. This is not Rubio. This is not Rubio specific. This is just a general thing. I think in evaluating candidates, we actually overrate accomplishments far too much and underrate other qualities. I mean, like judgment, other qualities like sort of, good timing, honestly.
Counterintuitive argument on this. Accomplishments are actually harmful when you're running for president.
Yes.
Like Joe Biden accomplished a lot of things, including a lot of things 15 years ago that now that politics has turned make him look really bad to this generation of liberal voters. Having a lot of accomplishments means having been part of a lot of complicated pieces of legislation that have made losers as well as winners. And winners tend to be diffuse and losers tend to be concentrated.
Very good. Well, now, I think we overrate character, but that's a different argument. I'm not up here to give my opinions. Now, we ready for questions? Where are the microphones? We ready to go? Anybody have questions? Okay. Step up, step forward. Let's, well, just raise your hands. They'll come to you, I guess, right? Give us your name and you're a townie? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Danielle Thomas. I am from Charleston, West Virginia originally, but now Morgantown is my home. I actually help organize Morgantown for Bernie Sanders with these two right here, so like us on Facebook or Twitter if you're interested in being involved. But so I kind of want to give a real quick preface to this question. So I read a really interesting quote on Tumblr, which I'm sure you guys are all aware of, and it was a quote, Tumblr wisdom at its finest, that said, our society is so focused on binaries that people literally think that cats are the opposites of dogs. And it kind of struck a chord with me because it does also ring true in politics. There's this it's us against them mentality. Someone like me, because I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter, can't possibly find common ground with someone like Mercedes, which is just absolutely ridiculous, but that thought does exist. So my question for you is, what role do you see the media playing in kind of bringing bipartisanship to a front? Because I think what a lot of millennial people are tired of seeing is partisanship. We're tired of the fighting. We want to see things get done.
I can tell you that your sharing habits on Facebook do not suggest that to be the case.
At least in my group of friends.
I always find you're on camera, and I'm on a lot with Mike on Fox, and you're off camera, and we have these great conversations, and then you get on camera, and all of a sudden everyone's in their position, ready to talk about their side or defend their story. And I think it's hard for the media to do that. I think our media has actually become more divided. Obviously, as a viewer or listening to the radio, you're going to choose between listening to like a Rush Limbaugh, let's say, if you're a conservative, and then you're going to get that, that's where you get your source of information. And so you're always trying to figure out where is that, or MSNBC on the liberal side. And so you're going to go where you want to hear what you want to hear. And so I think it does become a challenge for the media, because obviously they're thinking about ratings, they're thinking about the viewers that they want to bring in, or the readers that are going to read their information. And so I think the media is not necessarily looking for that to create the bipartisanship. And unfortunately, when you have 24-hour news cycles and you have breaking news all the time, you have the sense of individuals, first of all, wanting to comment on everything. And, I'll never forget it. We were at a dinner with a congressman, I won't say the name, and President Obama gave a speech, and I don't think the guy listened to the speech. And he's like, well, I already know what I'm going to say. I'm like, wait a second, you didn't even listen to the speech. And that's a problem. Like, we just go straight into our sides. And I think that that's really counterproductive for our society. The fact that, and it's, I think, part of the problem of political gridlock, where you're saying, wait, we can't have the Democrats and Republicans work together and get a solution. I mean, that's what we need to be working for. And there are plenty of bipartisan legislation out there, but I do believe that President Obama has created a bit of this sense of us versus them mentality, or like Hillary Clinton's comment about the Republican being the enemy. I mean, I don't think that's helpful.
This side of the room? I'd like to get more questions, if that's okay. Anything on this side of the room? This gentleman?
I got lucky. You were going to rip me.
My name's Chris. I'm from Charleston, West Virginia. I actually wanted to piggyback off of something that Ezra was saying in that, we're focusing a lot on these presidential elections, but over the past 6 years, there's been historic losses for Democrats in state houses and governors in Congress. And West Virginia is a pretty perfect example of that. We had an enormous shift this past election. And as a Democrat, it's a bit concerning to see a lot of other Democrats take solace in just simple demographic trends across society. And I think that there hasn't been enough self-reflection. So my question is really, what have Republicans, apart from just running against Obama and out-raising Democrats at the state level, what have they done wrong, and what can the Democrats do better in terms of moving forward in these types of smaller elections?
I tend to think that the number one thing Democrats could do to improve their position in the states is to lose next year. That if American politics works anything like we think it does, a Republican presidency will bring a reaction in Congress, in the state houses. I think, so the to be sure part of this is I think some of the Democratic losses on the state level are a function of long-term structural trends that just aren't going to be reversed anytime soon. And so, one of the striking things about American politics in the past 7 or 8 years is the literal death of the white Southern Democrat. If you look basically below Virginia at this point, there are very few statewide elected or nationally elected, meaning they serve in the House, white Democrats, and most of the South, outside of its most heavily non-white areas, is Republican, and that's a long-term trend. That's going back 40 years, and we've seen pretty much the culmination of that. So is that going to be reversed? And if it isn't reversed, then that basically knocks a chunk of the country out in terms of Democratic gains down the ballot. That doesn't explain Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or any of the places where Democrats have had a real weakness at that level. And in that case, I really do think what Democrats can do is just lose next year.
Over here.
Hey, my name's John Kasich, and I'm the sister of John Kasich, the governor of Ohio. Wow. So I'm interested in hearing lightning round responses as to what you think of him in his campaign, because he has great qualities, and he's also accomplished a lot in Washington, D.C. and in Ohio.
Oh, I see the resemblance, totally.
Wow. Are you for real? Yeah?
I mean, come on, anybody could show up to a panel claiming to be John Kasich's sister.
Well, I'm Marco Rubio's sister because I'm Cuban-American, right from his neighborhood.
ID her. Yeah, you do. You do. But you don't have that southwestern Pennsylvania accent that is no. How'd that happen? Anyway, let's do the John Kasich lightning round. Come on, people.
I think John Kasich's problem in the Republican primary really is that the Republican primary is in this odd place right now, right? Like I think in 2012, Kasich I think would have been a shoo-in, right? Like I think he would have done fantastic. But the dynamics of this primary is such that I think he's having a hard time. I think he will have a hard time kind of going beyond where he is. And I think the strategy of trying to differentiate himself on issues that the Republican grassroots cares very much about, like immigration, may not work, even though substantively they may be a good place to be.
This is a very surface level critique, but I would love to see him be a little more animated in debates. He's had some real shining moments so far in those, and so that's just like such a bubble to attract so many people, because so many people just watch the debates and then don't necessarily follow the day-to-day news. And so I would love to see him just, get a little more animated and excited and try to stand out a little bit from the rest of the field in that setting.
I think a consistent problem for candidates who want to run on some level as a reformer of their parties is that it is hard to run as both a critic of the party and as someone who fundamentally likes the party and its voters. And I think voters very fundamentally want to be liked by their candidates. And I think one problem with John Kasich is that he is correct in identifying that the tax and immigration plans that Republicans have rallied around are like literally crazy. Like actually, you would have to be, there's something wrong if you think you could achieve those.
Please, Ezra,
but
come
people
on.
do not enjoy hearing that. And voters want to be liked.
I think for Governor Kasich, he's an honest broker. He's too logical to even be running at this point because we're not what you would call a very functional party right now. And what I do hear a lot in the green room, I don't know why, but sometimes you can learn stuff in the green room, is they always talk about a Rubio-Kasich ticket, which is fascinating. They always link the two together. And the problem is that this is a year of the outsider versus the insider. And the outsider at this point in the race, now it is November, that's where Republicans are leaning towards. But the reality is that only 25% of Republicans at this point are committed to a candidate. So does he have room for growth? He could, but it's a tough cycle. It's a tough cycle. But a great guy. You're a lucky sister.
Yeah, and he's probably a lucky brother. And, one more from this side of the room.
Thank you. I've been looking up the Conservative Union while I'm here, and I noticed that I'm Barry Wendell. I live in Morgantown, but I'm from Baltimore originally, and I'm a classic Hollywood liberal. But that the Conservative Union in the past at their conventions has not allowed the log cabin Republicans
Wait, Schlapp, this is yours. I'm not taking this one. Are you kidding me?
or the other gay group in the GOP to distribute information
Go
or
Proud,
to
right?
Go Proud. I'm just wondering if you, anyone can answer this, if you think that a Republican president will try to, and a Republican Congress will try to overturn same-gender marriage in the United States. I'm in a same-gender marriage, and that would upset me a lot.
Okay, first I'd like to say that my husband spoke at the Log Cabin Republican meeting last month. And if you were to see his comments, he's very much about saying, you know, gay conservatives are more than welcome to be part of it, part of American Conservative Union.
As long as they're not married.
No, that's not true. So with that being said, you know, I think that the Supreme Court has made that decision. It's the law of the land. I don't think you're going to see a change in that, even with a Republican president. I think what we need to be talking about is ensuring that there's a protection of religious liberties for those who believe in traditional marriage. You know, our party is big enough to be able to handle both, you know, in being a welcoming party, but there needs to be respect for those that believe in traditional marriage, as there should be respect for those who believe in same-sex marriage. And I think that that's where it's at. And if you have any further questions, refer to the guy with white hair over there. He's a chairman, and he'll be happy to answer any questions you have. Okay.
Well, now we're going to start wrapping up. But now I want to do an interesting thing here, which I did the last time I moderated one of these. And the results were useful, and I think turned out to be just about right. We're going to take a straw poll of you to see who you think is going to be the next president of the United States, not who you want to be, okay? Not who you want to be. Put your objective hat on and raise your hand when I call the name of the person who you think is going to be, in all likelihood, the next president. This is useful for all of us, right? Right. Now, Donald Trump. Not one. Not one. Huh. Ben Carson. Ah, okay. Okay, 3. Ted Cruz. Okay, 3. Marco Rubio. Jeb Bush. Hillary Clinton.
Wow. Okay.
Bernie Sanders. We're in a part of West Virginia that isn't really West Virginia. But that was very useful for us all to see. Now, I want closing statements from the panelists along the following lines. And this has not to do with the presidential election per se, but a broader political question that was alluded to by this citizen right here, and that I'm sure all of these folks who bother to come out to an event like this a year away from an election think about and are very concerned about. When will our current state of polarization end, and what combination of forces will make it end? Is there any hope for these folks? Or if there's not hope, let's tell them there's not. But spend 2 minutes talking about that.
So it's useful to look back to our last period of bipartisanship, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. I think we tend to treat this as sort of a golden era of American politics. But one reason why bipartisanship is even possible is because there is almost a national consensus about Jim Crow. Southerners were like, this is the thing that we do. And Northerners were like, we're not going to bother you about it. And once you took that off the table, you could debate lots of things. You couldn't debate that. You couldn't do anything about that. But you could debate all sorts of legislation and have all sorts of bipartisanship when everyone kind of accepted as like the basic premise of American politics that we were going to disenfranchise a whole chunk of American citizens. Once that ended, once that got taken off the table, then all of a sudden, people who believed in, who believed in government intervention, decided, why am I in a party with a bunch of people who don't believe this? The only thing that really unified us was this one thing, so I'm going to switch sides, and vice versa. And American politics sorted out by ideology, and here we are. Two camps of people, or many camps of people, disagree very intensely about things, and barring circumstances where one party controls the White House and Congress, nothing really gets done legislatively. I think what might change that from where we are now is something else that kind of just scrambles things a bit, that makes so that there are liberals in the Republican Party and conservatives in the Democratic Party. And I don't know what that thing is. Now, my hunch is that as the country's demography changes, and as sort of specifically what conservatism looks like begins to change, you might see a return to bipartisanship in a regular sense. But I will emphasize again that our era of bipartisanship, in a real sense, was not good. It was not good that for the better part of a century, we kind of collectively decided, collectively minus 12 to 13% of the population, that this group of people should be disenfranchised. And so if polarization is what we have to pay for a politics that doesn't do that anymore, I think it's a fine price to pay.
I think the real answer to this question kind of goes back to what Ezra was saying at the very start of this panel, which is that none of us actually know anything, really, anything that's going to be happening. So I don't really know if there's a good answer to this question. Speaking from a media standpoint strictly, and not so much of a political standpoint, I think a lot of what can help, at least in the way that the parties are covered, is, we were talking before this panel at a dinner that, a lot of what drives things is what people want to read, and even another very surface level observation, but now, this early in the race, it's very funny to ask, a Democrat, like, who would you want to work with that's a Republican, and vice versa, and then watch them completely blow off the question. That was like a whole 5 minutes of the debate on Tuesday, the GOP debate. Hillary Clinton did it in a Today Show interview, I think, and like Mercedes says, she's called the Republicans the enemy. That will clearly change, the closer we get to November 2016, but I think that from a media standpoint, just accepting those kind of like laughy answers, like, oh, I would never work with somebody in the opposite party, is not really acceptable. I think reporters can do a better job of, really shaping coverage in a way that presents, bipartisanship is a good thing, and less so in a way, this actually goes back a lot to what you were asking. I think that we do kind of cover things in a way that maybe leans in one direction or the other, depending on whatever issue you're talking about. And so I think as the media, we could do a bit better at covering those things in that way and at framing the questions and at forcing politicians to sort of address that a bit more.
This is a great question, Mike. It's so good that I'm going to take my microphone out of the thing for emphasis. Mike asked if there is hope for polarization reverse, and if not, to tell you there is no hope. And so the absolute most important thing I'm going to tell you tonight, the one thing I want you to remember is there is no hope. And I mean that very seriously. Polarization, as Jamel said, depolarized political systems are extraordinarily rare and they're aberrational. The reason we had a period of depolarization in American politics was that race scrambled American politics for extraordinarily toxic reasons. You had a period of time in the 1950s when the second most conservative member of the Senate was a Democrat. That is not, and the first most conservative was a Republican. That's actually not a reasonable way to run a political system, because then you have Democrats in South Carolina voting for Strom Thurmond, Democrats in Massachusetts voting for whoever they're voting for, and they're not getting a choice. The party is actually scrambling their choice. We have developed a very lazy heuristic in American politics where we have decided that the problem in American politics is party polarization, which it is. And as such, the only way to fix it is to go back to this nostalgic, lovely era 40 years ago when we agreed to not let black people use the same bathrooms we used, and that's how we fixed the issue. The way mature political systems deal with party polarization, which they all have, is they just make the political system work with polarization. They don't have things like the filibuster. They don't have staggered elections in the way we do. We are very unusual in that we don't let majorities govern. Ron Brownstein, who's a great political analyst, has this fantastic line where he says, America's developed parliamentary parties without parliamentary rules. What we're going to need to do, and what we're already doing, by the way, Democrats weakened the filibuster a couple of years ago. McConnell is thinking about weakening it further now. We are going to change the rules of American politics to make American politics work more smoothly in an era of polarization. But once polarization like this begins, it's a flywheel. You couldn't have Fox News and MSNBC in the ways they are now in the era of depolarization, because you couldn't have as clear sides that you were drawing. The ideology and the parties were scrambled. But once they're unscrambled, all of a sudden, political identity becomes a much more powerful form of identity. And as it becomes a more powerful form of identity, a market arises to cater to it. So polarization is not going to stop. It's going to get worse. And the thing we are going to do about it, which is already happening in small ways and in big ways across the country, is we are going to evolve our political system, as we have done before, in the direction of other political systems around the world. We're not ever going to go full parliamentary, but we are going to, around the edges, make it easier for majorities to govern. And in periods of divided government, you're going to see things like you see now, which is a more empowered executive doing more on their own. I'm not saying this is good, but this is what is going to happen.
Not only am I going to take my mic out, but I'm going to sing to you the answer. No, I'm kidding. I'm not. There was a time not long ago that actually presidents and Congress worked together. I mean, we look at President George W. Bush, and he worked with Senator Ted Kennedy to strike a deal of No Child Left Behind. There was a time when you had Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, and they would work out deals too. This did happen. And sometimes it does take a national tragedy like 9/11 to really unite the country. So we did see these situations, these events happen in the political system. But I'm a little more hopeful. I find that you could discover that candidate who could really bring the two parties together. But it's going to take someone that may not be necessarily worried about the re-election, or maybe they win the first term and they're way into their second term, and then they say, we need to get work done in D.C. Because I think one of the biggest frustrations that the American public, what they have, is this political gridlock. They hate it. Millennials, you look at the numbers, one of the biggest frustrations also for them is this political gridlock in D.C. And I think that there is this urgency, this sense in the American public that they want to see if Washington can actually function and work together. This dysfunctionality, the fact that you've had, on both sides, President Obama unable to strike deals on the Republican side. I mean, the only time we really saw that was with Senator Joe Biden and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell on the tax cuts. We have to start finding a little bit more of this common ground. And so I think that there is hope. I think maybe it does take a national event to happen, or maybe it takes a candidate who can win and then say, you know what, we got to bring the Democrats in on this, and I'm not going to be too concerned about my poll numbers if they go down. But that could happen. But it can't start with the negativity of saying the enemy is a Republican or the enemy is a Democrat. We're going to get nowhere. And I think it's our obligation, and each and every one of you as voters, to send that message very clearly and say, look, you guys, pull it together. Make this work. Make Washington work. Let's pass legislation that makes sense for the American people. Let's find the middle ground on issues like immigration and healthcare and education and on tax policy. I mean, even like tax reform, something that we can find bipartisan support. I mean, it just gets boggled down and stuck in Congress. And so I think that these congressional leaders and the next president will need to rise to the occasion, because I think the American public will demand it.
Well, there we are, folks. So I was sternly warned that people's patience, students' patience in particular, couldn't possibly endure more than an hour and 15 minutes, but you've been sitting here for an hour and a half, and I've only noticed a couple of people leave, and no one fall asleep, so we must have done all right. I hope that you learned something from this and didn't come away too depressed. I think what we learned is don't trust any of us, and
there is no hope.
And there's no hope. And
hope and change.
Yeah, and the world is changing too fast. Yogi Berra said it, right? We may be lost, but we're making good time. Thanks, folks. Thanks for coming.